It's not often you see a modern turn-based RPG take the world by storm, especially one made by a brand new developer. Sandfall Interactive, a team founded by ex-UBISOFT employees, came out swinging with their first published game, Expedition 33. A JRPG developed by a French studio might sound like a drastic clash of culture on paper, but in actuality, it was the secret sauce that grabbed people's attention. Since its release, Expedition 33 has garnered immense critical and financial success. People love this game, even those who don't normally play turn-based RPGs. That's nothing short of impressive for a new IP, let alone one from a smaller studio. It's funny, you'd think that, as a guy who's known for talking about these sorts of games and is always willing to try out stuff outside of their comfort zone, that I would have been all over Expedition 33 at launch. But for some reason or another, I never got around to playing it until recently. After going through the game myself, I'm hesitant to say if I fully agree with all of the praise. In a lot of ways, I find Expedition 33 to be a well-made, content-rich experience. However, I can't help but feel frustrated at the experience on the whole. Not in a "this is a bad game" sort of way, more like a "this is very, very close to being something amazing" kind of way. I don't think Expedition 33 is a bad game, and depending on the type of person you are, I can imagine it really appealing to you. But if you're someone like me who plays more turn-based RPGs than the average person, then this game's flaws become a lot more apparent. Some issues here or there aren't a big deal, but there are some pretty big design flaws with Expedition 33 that are hard to ignore, and I'm certainly not alone in feeling this way. Over the past few months, I've noticed a bit more critical discussion surrounding this title, though oftentimes it eventually devolves into something less constructive. Kind of like Xenoblade Chronicles 2, people just lose all sense of self when it comes to talking about this one. This implies to both the haters and the enjoyers. I don't know, man, some of you guys are acting like this game is the second coming of Jesus, and I mean it's good, but there exists room for critical discussion. This video doesn't come from a place of hate. I do what I do, not because I like dunking on other people's hard work, but because I see the vision. I see what the developers are going for with Expedition 33. Just like with all art, you don't create your masterpiece in just a few brushstrokes, as I'm sure Sandfall is aware of. Expedition 33 is a game that manages to shine in a lot of areas, and I'll be sure to highlight those when I can. But it's also a game that feels frustratingly at odds with itself, its inspirations sometimes clashing in rather harsh ways. I want to get down to the nitty-gritty of it, see how this game ticks and why its issues bother me as much as they do. In order to do that, I'm gonna have to talk about spoilers, so go play the game yourself if you haven't. This is your only warning. In the modern day, there exists two types of people. There are the turn-based truthers who accept the combat style for what it is, and then there are the weak. I'm not sure when it happened, but at some point or another, the mere concept of turn-based combat became outdated. Not certain styles of turn-based games, I mean turn-based combat on the whole. I know I'm right, because a lot of people make a big deal about it not being for them. It's like they have to stand on a soapbox to proudly announce that they found some shit like Final Fantasy VII overrated or whatever. And what's funny is that when they do use said game as an example, it's almost always the tutorial section, as if it's somehow indicative of the entire experience. Turn-based combat sort of has a reputation for being too slow or uninvolved, and a lot of people don't like that. I can sort of see where they're coming from if they're used to only playing real-time games. People tend to be adverse to trying new things, especially if it's something that they're convinced they won't like based on limited exposure. Video games are expensive, and they're a time sink, especially RPGs. Stepping outside your comfort zone in this scenario is more intimidating than watching a new movie. What these people fail to realize, though, is that the key to trying new things is to meet it halfway. Rather than adjusting expectations and learning to love something new, they instead want the activity itself to conform to their pre-existing preferences. For many years, studios have been trying to find ways to make turn-based games more appealing to the widest markets possible. While different solutions have been tested over the years, one that has stuck around the longest has been the reaction-based RPG. These are experiences that take elements from real-time games and combine them with the strategy of traditional turn-based combat. The idea is to represent the best of both worlds to create something unique. The problem with this approach, however, is that in practice, these two types of games go together like oil and water. They come from entirely different worlds and have completely different priorities. Turn-based games rely entirely on the player's planning abilities. Customization and pre-fight strategizing are the key to victory in those games. While execution of the strategy and moment-to-moment thinking does matter, how you manage your characters outside of the combat scenario is just as important. Real-time games are the opposite. Execution is prioritized, with strategy taking a bit of a back seat. The reason why this divide even exists at all is purely due to how both games treat player damage. In turn-based games, damage is oftentimes inevitable. Sure, variables exist, and you can even sway the odds in your favor through the use of buffs and debuffs, but there's almost no way to guarantee that the player won't receive damage. That constant threat of damage is something that needs to be considered with every action. For example, when playing a game like Metaphor ReFantasio, the entire strategy of any given turn hinges on what happened during the enemy's turn. If an attack deals more damage than expected, then it's a good idea to use your limited actions to either heal your party up, increase defenses, lower the enemy's power, and so on. If you think you can tank a hit or you don't need to use all of your characters defensively, then you're in the clear to go to town. This back and forth doesn't exist in real-time games because, technically speaking, all damage is optional. Split-second reactions and animation reading matter significantly more since everything is done in the moment. Action games like Devil May Cry put all of their chips on player execution because that's what real-time games are good at. These two types of games are so fundamentally different, and I don't think people fully understand that combining them together is easier said than done. Lean too much into the action side and the RPG elements become pointless, and vice versa. This is the unfortunate position that Expedition 33 finds itself in, and why I struggle to enjoy the combat system of this game. On the surface, Expedition 33's combat might look to be what you would expect out of this type of game. 3 party member setup, skill trees, customization, add a layer of strategy, the works really. When looking at the actual combat of Expedition 33 and how it's implemented on a baseline, things are functional if a little uninspired. The core foundations of E33 is built on the tried and true formula that worked for decades, but with a few tweaks here and there to add some flavor. For example, on top of each skill having its own timing-based minigame, they also have conditional bonuses to help make them feel more distinct from each other aside from damage. Usually, it ties into that character's unique gimmick. For example, Mael is a stance-based character. After every attack, she'll cycle between one of her 3 stances. Each one specializes in different aspects of combat. Some stances might inherently look to be worse than others, but that doesn't mean they're useless, because Mael's attacks all make use of them in some way or another. Whether that be by dealing bonus damage, swapping instantly to another type of stance, getting an additional action, or buffing up her burn damage. This makes choosing what skill you want to use at any given time come down to a little bit more than just raw damage. This rule applies to every other character, and it does work well enough in making the party members feel distinct. Ciel has this interesting card gimmick. Certain skills add sun or moon charges while providing a unique debuff to the enemy. The goal with Ciel is to soften enemies up a little while you build your own power before unleashing the pain on the enemy. Every character has a gimmick like this, and it does a great job at making their piloting experience feel distinct, even if ultimately the only thing that matters is maximizing damage. Lune plays very differently from Monoko, who is nothing like Mael, who is nothing like Gustav, and so on. If there's something I can give Expedition 33 credit for, it would be that. Oftentimes, the gameplay feels less like you're piloting a team of characters, rather it feels like controlling 3 individual fighters that happen to be battling the same creature. There's room for skill synergy in an environment like this, but it's fairly light. oftentimes boiling down to what buffs and debuffs you decide to use. It's funny that for a game that was inspired by classics like Final Fantasy, I ended up playing E33 sort of like I do Pokemon. You know, focusing less on the overall team composition and more so boosting any character's individual strengths. And it's here where the game's customization shines the most. On top of every character having a distinct weapon type and skill tree to call their own, each character can equip up to 3 Pictos. Think of it like equipment from Final Fantasy IX. Pictos are your main source of passive abilities. On top of each of them providing stat modifiers to whatever character has them, every Picto comes with a passive skill. Most of these are just flat out upgrades, stuff like critical hit rate increases, AP restoration, auto skills, and so on. But eventually, you do gain access to Pictos with some absurdly good abilities, like being able to act twice in a row and lifting the damage cap. While every character is limited to 3 Picto slots, there is a mastery system in place that lets you stockpile your favorite effects. That way, you can equip all the stat-boosting Pictos without losing out on any of the supportive abilities. The Picto system is a solid idea, but it's nothing that we haven't seen before in this type of game. But that doesn't detract from the fun factor of it. If you're the kind of person that loves to optimize their characters in RPGs, then Expedition 33 offers plenty of avenues for that. But unfortunately, it's not something that can be fully tapped into until the end of the game due to the damage cap. Really, this should be the type of game that I'm all over. A gameplay-first RPG is very rare nowadays. Even some of the greats have been slowly deprioritizing the gameplay aspect of the experience. So it's nice to get a new game from a new studio that puts value in that stuff. The problem, though, is that despite all of this, I ultimately found myself unable to enjoy the combat of Expedition 33, and all of that ire is due to one central mechanic. The thing that put Expedition 33 on the map, the game's greatest strength, is also the game's greatest weakness. Let me show you something. You see that? If you can do that, you have beaten the game. All the stuff that I mentioned involving character abilities and customization, that doesn't matter. The key to success in Expedition 33's combat has nothing to do with strategizing or planning, and has everything to do with the game's parry system. While not the first turn-based game to implement real-time elements, Expedition 33 stands out to me due to the importance of them. The parry in this game rules above all. It's meant to be the high-risk, high-reward hook to keep you engaged, and during the initial hours of the game, it actually accomplishes that goal. The parry in this game functions about how you would expect. It's about timing and pattern recognition. Parries nullify all incoming damage, and if you manage to parry the entirety of the enemy's attack sequence without failing, then you'll retaliate with a counterattack of your own. The issue with Expedition 33's parry isn't so much in its innate function, rather it's in how much emphasis is placed on what is ultimately a rather shallow mechanic. The parry in E33 is the greatest tool the player has at their disposal. While it is possible to beat the game without using the parry at all, it's very clear to me that it was built entirely around this function, and ignoring it would be going against the intended playstyle. On top of the benefits that I already mentioned, the parry also serves as the main method to recovering AP mid-combat. Every successful parry regenerates 1 AP for that party member. This can be further increased through mastering certain Pictos. Since every character is hard capped at 9 AP, it's a limit that can easily be reached off of a few parries. Counterattack damage is insanely strong and can be upgraded to automatically apply debuffs. This allows you to shortcut potential strategies, skipping over the setup phase and instantly applying pressure. The parry is the heart and soul of E33's combat. In a lot of ways, this is a game where your defensive abilities matter significantly more than your offensive play. My strategizing and execution comes second to my timing abilities, which shouldn't be the case in this kind of game. It goes back to what I said earlier, turn-based combat is interesting because damage is unavoidable. In other turn-based games, real thought needs to go into every single action because you need to account for the enemy's retaliation. Since all damage is technically optional in Expedition 33, The dynamic between enemy and player is a lot less interesting. It makes the combat feel like it takes place on two separate planes of existence. My turns feel disconnected from the rest of the battle because the only thing that matters is how much damage I can do at any given time. There's no reason to set up a defensive strategy because there's already a system in place to negate all damage. Expedition 33's parry is often touted as a high-risk, high-reward mechanic, but that's not entirely accurate. While there is risk to parrying, the reward greatly outweighs any potential consequences. Let's run down that list real quick. By parrying, you negate all damage, gain resources, apply pressure for free, and potentially set up status effects that enhance your game plan. The only risk there is to messing up a parry is receiving damage, the same amount of damage as if you didn't even attempt one in the first place. Granted, that damage could be enough to knock out a character depending on your build, but death isn't all that punishing in this game. Not only are there a generous supply of revival items, but getting a game over lacks consequence. In fact, it might actually be better to get a game over than it is to rely on those support items. This is because party wipes instantly sent you back to the start of battle without any real penalty. You're actually rewarded for death because while the fight itself might have reset, the knowledge gained from the previous attempts is permanent. The reason why this matters is because Expedition 33 rewards the player with bonus experience if they manage to get through the encounter without receiving damage. Since there's no punishment for getting a game over, fights are easily optimized and mastered. For there to be risk, there needs to be a punishment. If the only risk of dying in Expedition 33 is an encounter reset, then I struggle to see how this makes up from the overwhelming benefit of the parry. If dying had a tangible impact on the player's progression, then there would be a lot more tension in encounters. E33 already has a bonfire checkpoint system in place, but it only matters to your consumable items and level ups. If dying in combat set you back to the last checkpoint instead of resetting the encounter, then parrying comes with more tension. However, if the game were to go in that direction, one other change would need to be made. While not coming with as many benefits as the parry, the manual dodge still prevents all damage, but with a more generous window. Yes, this is technically a worse option than the parry, but it still gives the most important benefit for free, that being survivability. If you were to ask me, I don't think there should have been a dodge button. Rather, just put all the eggs in that parry basket. This would mean that if you wanted to avoid damage at all, then you would need to get good at the parry. In return, make the player's base survivability a little bit more generous. At least allow people to tank a few more hits so that they get the opportunity to try and fail without instantly losing. With those small changes, I believe that a more checkpoint-based level progression can work, and would be more engaging than the structure that exists now. Long-term consequences are important to these types of games, not just in the sense that it makes every encounter mean something, but it can also act as a way to help enhance the game's world. Expedition 33 tells a story about grief, how people who have experienced loss deals with those emotions. The expedition serves as a way for these lost individuals to turn that grief into something a bit more positive. However, something that the story stresses is that venturing out of Lumiere is guaranteed to end in death. The world is filled with dangerous monsters that can easily rip the average person to shreds. While this is reflected in the story itself, the problem is that this isn't reflected in the gameplay, at least in its current state. Again, changing the checkpoint system would help with this. Aside from the overwhelming benefits granted to the player, my biggest issue with the parry in E33 would be in how the game handles enemy attacks. To me, the main appeal to parries in video games comes from animation reading and timing. My favorite parry in games is the Royal Guard from Devil May Cry. Those games have two types of parries. There's the more generous one that lets you block some attacks while taking less damage, and then there's the perfect block, which negates all damage and can block every attack. Royal Guarding on its own doesn't give the player an insane advantage. Since DMC is a real-time game, it's up to the player to find those openings during the onslaught and rely on their own skill to exploit it. The reason why parries work in real-time games is because attacks are unpredictable. There's enough variance in play to prevent parrying from becoming your default defense. If the enemies in DMC always attacked in the same pattern and timing, then it would get boring fast. This is a problem that Expedition 33 faces due to the innate limitations that come with turn-based combat. Every enemy only has a handful of attacks, and due to the way actions work in these types of games, you'll most likely only get to see one of them at any given time. Since E33 announces every single attack through a text box, it's not hard to figure out what attacks an enemy is about to do before it even happens. To make up for this, the game slowly increases the number of attacks that need to be parried at any given time. There's a lot of attacks that change timing mid-combo, and eventually some extra modifiers are thrown in too, like jumping and a special gradient counter. These variables are meant to keep things fresh, and maybe they do to some extent, but the big problem the game runs into is that the parry itself isn't a deep enough mechanic to carry the game. Parrying in Expedition 33 isn't about animation reading and reaction time. Rather, it's solely a game of memorization. Since every attack is announced ahead of time and there's no punishment for getting a game over, it's easy to crack the code, so to speak. I might have a lot of footage of me dying, but that doesn't mean that Expedition 33 is a hard game. Due to the over-reliance on the parry system, it's difficult for me to remember specifics about a certain fight. I might remember what they look like, the framing, or the story surrounding the encounter, but I can't remember anything unique in regards to their gameplay design. Even if there were small gameplay gimmicks like this Simon Says puzzle, ultimately the outcome of the fight boiled down to one thing. Could I parry the enemy's attack? If yes, then I won. If not, then it's only a matter of time before I can. I already know a lot of people are about to say that if I don't like the parry, then I can just ignore it. Those types of hand waves have never sat right with me. Not only is this just a poor way to ignore criticism of something you like, but can you seriously look at me in the eye and tell me that fucking Expedition 33 doesn't want you to use the parry as much as possible? Like, really? Really? My issue with the parry in this game isn't based on the fact that it exists. The problem is in how suffocating it is. For a simple idea that should really be nothing more than a bonus for the player, it ends up being rooted in the entirety of E33's design. Ignoring the parry puts you at such a massive disadvantage that it's just not worth it. Just because you can beat the game without using the parry doesn't mean that it was the intended playstyle or even all that fun. You can beat Final Fantasy X without the sphere grid, but I doubt many people would want to play the game like that. Ignoring the sphere grid would be ignoring a major part of that game, and what makes it as fun as it is. The same is true for Expedition 33. The parry is a major part of the game. It's what people associate the most with it. The most fun I had with this game's combat was building my characters around the parry. But the problem with that, though, is that it exposes just how over-reliant E33 is on this mechanic, to the point where it overpowers everything else. I'm not inherently against the idea of turn-based games including real-time elements, but there needs to be an appropriate balance. Out of all of the games I've played that use this pseudo-real-time gameplay, I find that the Mario RPGs handle it the best, which is hilarious because the first crack at this formula was designed by Squaresoft, you know, the Final Fantasy guys. At a glance, games like Bowser's Inside Story might suffer from some of the same issues Expedition 33 does. They're both turn-based games where the outcome of battle is determined by your ability to perform real-time actions. The major difference, though, is the context and execution. I think it's easy for people to forget this fact, but Mario RPGs are children's games. They're spin-offs designed to act as an entry point in case you were too intimidated to play Nintendo's more traditional RPG offerings. Their simplistic nature and emphasis on real-time interaction is more so a carryover of the franchise's roots than anything. All of the actions you do in the Mario RPGs derives from the mainline franchise in one way or another. This makes jumping into the RPGs feel like second nature since you're not learning a new skill, you're just applying them in a different scenario. It mostly works because we already associate Mario with these actions. Even if we were to ignore the psychological connection and focus solely on game design, I still find Bowser's Inside Story to be a more compelling game than Expedition 33. Mario's combat might be simple, but it makes the most out of everything you have at your disposal. There's no ultimate counter skill in Mario and Luigi. Dodging matters in these games, but it's not the sole defining aspects of these fights. Fuck up a bro's attack and you'll be wasting the resource and the action for that turn. Mario and Luigi, despite being made for beginners, is a lot more comfortable with letting the player fail than Expedition 33 is, and that just blows my mind. It also helps that these games never overstay their welcome, with the average playtime being less than 20 hours. It's not like the only thing you're doing is combat either. These titles have a lot of mini-games and specialized gameplay segments to help break up the pace and prevent the core from getting stale. Mario and Luigi doesn't feature my ideal combat system. However, what I appreciate about these games is that they never try to be something that they're not. These aren't the most intense games in the world because they exist in the Mario universe, a world that's defined by the good guys winning because they're in the right, and the bad guys losing because they're villains. Stories like that don't need the most complex gameplay in the world to express that. Expedition 33's story is a lot more complex and morally gray than that. It's an intense world with real stakes and drama. I expect the game design to support that idea. However, what we're left with is an ultimately shallow combat experience. One where most of the gameplay systems can easily be ignored, and you can still make it through on the other end just fine. When you build your entire gameplay identity around one central idea, then it needs to have the proper amount of depth to keep players engaged for the runtime. It took me about 55 hours to finish Expedition 33. However, it only took about half of that time for me to see everything this game's combat system had to offer. There needs to be more meat on that bone for things to stay consistently engaging. I feel bad about saying this because it's clear that the designers at Sandfall truly believed in this game's combat. There is so much optional shit to do in this game that if it does jive with you, you'd be hard-pressed to run out of things to do. I could imagine a certain group of people getting a kick out of what's on offer here, but for me, parrying just isn't enough. The combat system is my least favorite part of Expedition 33. While it is a rather large gripe I have with the game, thankfully it wasn't enough for me to quit playing. I find that, outside of the combat, there is a lot to enjoy about E33. For starters, this game has some pretty cool art direction. Yeah, it's definitely got that UE5 look. But in terms of environments and how they're constructed, I actually think this is a pretty good looking game. I can remember nearly every single major location thanks in part due to the strong shot composition and visual identity. One of my favorite locations is this underwater dungeon near the start of the game. It's super striking, and the underwater motif is used for some fun enemy designs, like these little eyeball dudes with landmine weak points. There's a lot of cool spots to find when venturing around the overworld, both mandatory and optional. It is worth it to do the optional content in this game. Not only is it how you obtain the most overpowered pictos in the game, but a lot of it is story relevant. I think the biggest mistake you can make during a first time playthrough is heading right for the final dungeon at the start of Act 3. Doing the side activities is mandatory to get the most out of the story and world, but I feel like the game was designed in a way where you were supposed to ignore this stuff. I made sure to do almost everything I could before entering the last area, and I was so grossly over-leveled that all the tension was gone. It's more than possible to one-hit the final boss if you have a semi-competent build going on, and from what I hear, it was even easier to do at launch. I guess the intention was to go back and do cleanup during post-game, but in practice, that approach is kind of awkward. The ending of the story is so final that it only makes sense to do this stuff before reaching that point of no return. I guess it's only natural we talk about that stuff now. I wasn't too sure what to expect when playing through Expedition 33 for the first time. I didn't know much about the game at all aside from the name and that it was a turn-based RPG. This made the opening hours of E33 intriguing, but confusing. Okay, so the premise of this game is a bit out there. At some point in time, the world as we knew it came to an end when a great fracture occurred. This destroyed much of the world and people in it, with the only surviving group being this nation built in Lumiere. While this doesn't exactly spell out hopelessness on its own, the real kicker would be the constant doomsday clock held over people's heads. In the far-off distance, beyond the reach of any mere mortal, exists the Paintress, a deity that the citizens of Lumiere believe to be a malevolent god. This is because every year, the Paintress initiates what's become known as the Gommage. This event sees everyone beyond a certain age be erased from the world, with the threshold tightening every single year. What was once applicable to only people over the age of 100 has slowly been eroded. By the time the game begins, being able to live a life until your 30s is considered a privilege. Because of this annual execution, the people of Lumiere at some point decided to take matters into their own hands, sending the able-bodied out into the front lines in an attempt to defeat the Paintress and prevent the Gommage from ever occurring again. The opening hours of Expedition 33 caught me by surprise. While the whole Doomsday premise is one that I have seen before, what I wasn't expecting was the absolute confidence that Sandfall had with their storytelling. If there's one thing that oftentimes defines the JRPG subgenre of games, it would be their reliance on dialogue for storytelling. For example, one of my favorite studios is Atlus. They're known for making games that focus on people, the lives that they live, and ultimately what their role in the universe is. However, the way that this is expressed to the player is through literal means. Atlus games are quite chatty, more so than what the average gamer might expect. A lot of JRPGs are dialogue focused, for better and for worse. Good in the sense that it's near impossible to misinterpret what the story is trying to say, but bad in regards to immersion. It oftentimes feels like JRPG developers think that us players are incapable of understanding nuance in storytelling, as if we're somehow too stupid to comprehend the way visuals can be used to express a desired emotion. Events will play out in the narrative only to be immediately followed by dialogue that explains what we literally just saw. I get wanting to make sure your audience is following along, but in recent years, I feel as though the writing staff of these games don't trust the players nearly enough. This is why E33 is so refreshing. It manages to avoid the same trappings that have plagued a lot of the most popular JRPGs for years. That more Western-inspired dialogue and cutscene direction pulls a lot of weight in making this game stand out. The dialogue and character interactions is where the real strength of E33 begins to show. This game has a rather dark story, and it revels in that misery. At any point during the overworld exploration, you can set up a camp at base and take time to talk to everyone about how they're feeling. This allows us to see what makes them tick, figure out their motivations, and even build a connection between party members. What you'll quickly come to realize is that death and grief are at the core motivations of nearly every character. In a way, the expedition can be seen as an outlet for grief. It's that shared motivation that binds this group together, even if their personalities completely contrast. I find that the group's dynamic becomes a lot more interesting the moment Verso joins the party. He's the wild card that adds a much needed splash of unpredictability to the story. Verso can be manipulative, intentionally withholding information so he can get the outcome that he desires. There's always this silent feeling of distrust between him and most of the party, especially Lune. Though, what makes Verso a tragic character is that, despite the objectively shady things he does, it's not really something he likes doing. Verso has the strength to take action when it's necessary, but that doesn't mean he does so without any remorse or consequences. There's a large portion of players that outright dislike his character for certain decisions he makes, but that's just what makes him Laird. For example, Verso is introduced to the player through him saving Mael's life at the end of Act 1. However, his arrival was a little too late for him to prevent Gustave's death. At least, that's what we believe for most of the game. Near the end of the journey, we come to learn that Verso intentionally let Gustave die. Verso knew that if Gustave were to be around for the entire journey, it would only get in the way of his end goal. So Verso made the tough decision and inflicted pain on someone he actually really cared about. It's not something he's proud of, and it's even a secret that can be held for the entire story if you want, which I think adds a lot to his character. This implies that this white lie was something that was eating Verso up inside, and only continued to be on his mind whenever Gustave was mentioned. That's meaningful depth, and works to strengthen the tragedy surrounding him and Mael. This is a good thing because that melodrama is at the core of the story, and was easily my favorite part about it. A lot of people say that Act 3 ruined the story for them, but I can't help but severely disagree. If you were to ask me, Act 3 was when things started to get a lot more interesting. I wouldn't say that the first 2 acts of E33 were bad from a narrative standpoint, but it was a bit standard. Outside of the initial premise, not a whole lot really happens. The characters go from location to location with the goal of eventually making their way to the Paintress. A lot of the time is spent introducing us and showing off the creative world locations and creatures. This isn't bad on its own, not at all even. It's sick that the world of E33 is as thought out as it is. However, this runs the risk of coming off more so as a guided tour rather than a full-scale adventure. Really, what this portion of the game does best is plant the seeds for Act 3. Every so often, Mael is shown these visions of this mysterious girl with a disfigured face and white hair, accompanied by a much older man. The meaning and purpose of these scenes aren't exactly clear during a first-time playthrough, but once you reach the final portion of the story, everything starts to make a lot more sense. It turns out that the entire world of Expedition 33 and the people living inside of it are nothing more than a fantasy, a dream that was conjured up by the Desandras, a family of artists that have the ability to give life to their painted creations. Everything that we experienced, all of the death, hardship, and grief, was nothing more than just strokes on a canvas, specifically the canvas of the late Verso Desandra. You see, the Verso that we've known throughout the game is actually a painted replica of the Paintress's son. Not only that, but Mael herself is also related to the Paintress. In the real world, there exists an ongoing feud between writers and painters. While it's unknown how this feud started, and even how long it's been going on for, it's escalated to the point where these factions are willing to get their hands dirty if it means snuffing out those they hate. At some point or another, the writers took advantage of Mael's naivety, which eventually resulted in a fire at their mansion. While Mael and most of the family survived, it wasn't without consequences. Not only was Verso's life unfortunately lost, but Mael herself would suffer extreme physical deformities, her face and voice permanently destroyed. The death of Verso sent the entire Desandra family spiraling. None of them have ever suffered a loss like this, and most of the family was unable to cope in a healthy way. The only surviving piece of Verso's legacy was his old canvas. Painters are able to enter canvases almost like they're crossing over into another world, and their abilities to manipulate that space elevates them to a godlike level. Initially, it was only the mother who entered the canvas, using it as a way to live out the life that was stolen from her family. Only now, the painted copies of her family are immortal. Though her husband Renor was against this, as being inside of the canvas for extended periods of time has tangible consequences on the real-life counterpart. Renor eventually came to the conclusion that his family couldn't be trusted with Verso's canvas, deciding to take matters into his own hands and forcibly removing his wife. Mael was initially sent into the canvas to assist her father, though due to Align's influence over the domain, she would temporarily lose her memories, effectively being reborn as a new person. A lot of people say that this twist comes out of nowhere and permanently changes the direction of the story. While it might look like that on a literal level, thematically, this is exactly what the game was always about. Ultimately, Expedition 33 is a story about how people deal with grief. This was first introduced to us through the concept of the expedition, but is fully embraced by the time the mask comes off and we learn the truth. The Desandra family, much like those in Lumiere, are stuck in a constant state of grieving. They feel trapped and would rather submit to their misery than face it head on. Mael is no different. When she learned the truth of the canvas and regained her memory, she is unable to accept the fact that being stuck inside of here is terrible for her. Part of me understands that. After you lose someone that meant the world to you, it's easy to shut down. Mael doesn't have much waiting for her back at home. She's convinced herself that she's directly responsible for Verso's death, and her disability will prevent her from ever living a normal life. So, from Mael's perspective, the idea of living in a world where none of that pain needs to exist is desirable, especially for a teenager like her. She's got a very limited view on the world, and it's a perspective that's still developing. So when Maëlle sees that her own mother was using the canvas to live out a fantasy, she's able to rationalize the decision for herself. Sure, Aline might have been abusing the canvas, but that doesn't mean Maëlle will. At least, that's the story she tries to sell her dad, and it's one that the painted Verso sees right through. This is where the real conflict is introduced. Verso wants the canvas to be destroyed. His life was tragically cut short, yes, but his soul rests deep within the canvas, being forced to constantly paint until the end of time. For Verso's spirit to properly rest and for his family to move on from his death, the canvas needs to be destroyed, even if that comes at the cost of himself. While Maëlle desperately wants to hold on to this new life she has, even if it impacts her true self. This is a fine discussion. I've played quite a few games that deal with escapist themes, and I find that what E33 has to say to be a solid discussion. People always struggle to deal with grief. It affects us all in so many different ways, and I'm sure all of us would rather not have to go through something as difficult as losing a family member. Though loss is just an inevitability of life, it's out of our control. But what we can control is how we respond to that loss. While we might feel isolated in a vacuum, it's not a permanent situation. Holding out hope for a better tomorrow is difficult, but it's ultimately worth it in the long run, even if that means mustering up the courage to face that darkness head on. Where E33 starts to lose me a bit though, is in how this message is presented to the audience. For some reason or another, Expedition 33 has multiple endings. In a way, it makes sense. The story's climax is two major characters battling over an ideology, escapism versus reality. Where I feel the game fumbles though, is in treating those outcomes as equally valid. Let me play my hand real quick and say that Maëlle's ending is bad, both in terms of a conclusion for this story and in the message that it promotes. I firmly stand in the camp that what Maëlle wants makes total sense for her as a person. However, I don't think that the game benefits much from allowing you to side with it. In fact, I actually think it damages the game's message. E33 promotes the idea that when one of us falls, it's up to the survivors to carry out the living, holding on to the memory and legacy of those individuals while not letting that loss define us as people. Maëlle's ending goes against all of that. You're allowing her to submit to fantasy, disregarding Verso's legacy and wishes, just so she's allowed to have more playtime. However, by doing so, we're denying someone the opportunity for personal growth and sealing their fate permanently. If Maëlle is allowed to use the canvas at all, she'll turn out just like her mother. Someone afraid of loss, willing and able to manipulate the laws of reality when possible just so that she doesn't have to feel sad anymore. The most common argument towards Maëlle's ending is that it allows for the people of the canvas to continue living their lives, which is a good thing, but that hinges on whether or not the painted citizens are considered real people. This fact is at the center of most ending debates, and I don't think that it's as strong as some players make it out to be. This is for two major reasons. Firstly, I don't believe the painted people are real, mostly because the game never treats them as such. The Desundra family uses the canvas to play God. They create and shape the world and people however they see fit. At a snap of a finger, anyone who has died can be brought back to life. Problem with this, though, is that it eliminates the free will of the people living inside of the painted world. In Maëlle's ending, we see that everyone who had died is alive again. This includes Gustave and his girlfriend, characters that had already accepted their fate and embraced it with open arms. I'm sure they would have liked to have lived longer than they did, but the fact is, Maëlle denies these people the opportunity to die, period. She's essentially saying, no, you're not allowed to die yet because it would make me sad. This is proven to us because she purposely keeps the painted Verso alive so she doesn't have to lose her brother a second time. Sure, she can allow him to age and pursue his true passion in being a pianist, but it's an ultimately unfulfilling life for Verso. The fact is, Maëlle doesn't fully care what he wants, because if she did, then she wouldn't have repainted him in the first place. Mael's just too far deep in this fantasy life, and she refuses to leave it regardless of what happens to her. The other reason why this rubs me the wrong way is because of the metaphor itself. A lot of people tend to forget that stories featuring fantasy elements like this stem from reality. The high fantasy concepts are used as substitutes for real life. A lot of the damaging implications of Mael's ending become more noticeable when we start subbing out a few words here and there. I don't think anyone would agree that we should be giving alcoholics more beer just because it makes them happier in the moment. It's cool that they did make an alternate ending for Mael, but I firmly believe that choosing this one misses the entire point of the story. Sandfall has gone on and said that there is no good ending in Expedition 33, and I find that to be a very bad and potentially dangerous stance to take. The game might be rated M for mature, but you know for a fact that teenagers will be playing this. By presenting Mael's ending as equally valid as Verso's, they're saying that escapism is just as valid as actually confronting and overcoming your issues. That doesn't sit right with me, sorry. This isn't to say that Verso's ending is this squeaky clean, all's well that ends well outcome either. It's obvious that Mael is left to feel more alone than she has in a very long time. However, just like with real life, there comes a time where we eventually have to move on and continue with our lives. Letting go of pain can sometimes come with unexpected changes in life. Something that you once cared for can morph into self-destruction if we're not careful, and it's tragic that ended up being the last piece of Verso's legacy. But that doesn't mean his memory and what he stood for will be forgotten. It won't be easy, but when one falls, we continue, even if it hurts like hell. When all is said and done, Expedition 33 is a solid game. I know that might sound a bit strange considering how much critiquing I did, but it just goes to show that these issues were never enough to fully ruin this game for me. I find that the areas where E33 shines the most are incredible. Certain moments in the story, the cutscene direction, dialogue, and music do a lot to elevate material that might otherwise be overdone. If there's one thing I could compliment E33 for, it's that it knew what group it wanted to appeal to and managed to do so with enough confidence to get a large player base on board. Just recently, this game ended up completely sweeping the Game of the Year awards and has already developed a massive fanbase. For a new studio making their first RPG, that's incredible, and Sandfall should be proud of what they managed to accomplish. It's not easy to make a video game, especially one on the scale of this with limited budget and staff. Though part of me feels as though people hear the story behind this game's creation and decide to cut it a lot of slack. Ever since the initial release, Expedition 33 has been touted as one of, if not the greatest turn-based games ever made. A true genre-defining masterpiece that all games going forward should take notes from. And I can't help but feel as though we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves here. Yeah, the game is impressive, but if you played a lot of turn-based games like I have, then it's easy to notice where the real shortcomings are. The parry-based combat system is fragile and somewhat shallow. Dungeon design and traversal is basic. Certain gameplay elements are hilariously unpolished, to the point where it's obvious what was prioritized and what was just included because it could go in. Lately, it seems like players have this burning desire for their favorite thing to be the most popular and influential piece of fiction of all time. The word masterpiece is slowly being eroded to the point where it's losing all meaning, and I don't think handing out a title like that so easily is good feedback. We all need a bit of tough love in our lives. Improvements wouldn't be possible without that group willing to highlight where the dips are, though it's up to Sandfall to acknowledge those gripes and hopefully improve them going forward. I can easily see a world where Clair Obscur becomes this ongoing anthology series. Each game could focus on different forms of art and what they mean to people. The pieces are already in place, and you know what? I am looking forward to seeing what Sandfall has up their sleeves next. Expedition 33 might not be the greatest game ever made, but it's certainly one that's worth checking out. And, much like with all art, sometimes the seemingly imperfect painting might just be the one that resonates with you the most.
my turn.